What if I told you there was a night when the river won and America lost more than houses? Just after sunrise in late April of 1927, a fire whistle sounded in Greenville, Mississippi, the kind of alarm that makes a town move without thinking. People ran for the levee, not because they wanted a better view, but because the levee was the last line between high water and gone. A local eyewitness, Lucy Somerville Howarth, later described that panic and the slow horror of watching filthy floodwater creep in, then keep rising for days. Stay until the end, because what began as rain and mud turned into a national rupture, rewriting politics, the economy, and what Americans would come to expect when disaster hits. This was the Great Flood of 1927, the Mississippi flood that did not just swallow towns. It exposed what many people preferred to keep hidden, and it left a footprint so large it was measured in maps, not neighborhoods, inundating more than 70,000 square kilometers, about 27,000 square miles, and leaving over 700,000 people homeless. To understand how one flood could rattle the whole country, you have to start with the river itself. The Mississippi isn't just a river, it's a system, a spine that drains a huge portion of the nation, pulling water from thousands of miles of tributaries and sending it all toward the same channel. It drains roughly 41% of the contiguous United States, which means weather in one region can become water at your doorstep in another. In normal seasons, that system is life. It moves crops, commerce, and communities along its banks. But in 1927, the river wasn't feeding anything. The river was collecting, because the first blow didn't look dramatic. A stalled weather pattern in late 1926 kept dropping rain on the basin until the ground was saturated. And then winter and early spring kept adding more. Tributaries swelled. Runoff had nowhere to go except downhill, into the Mississippi, and into the levees that were about to be asked to do the impossible. Gauges kept rising, reports stacked up, and for a while the rest of the country kept breathing like this was a local problem, until it became everyone's. And that's how it starts, not with a wave, but with a number. A great flood doesn't explode, it tightens. It doesn't arrive in one dramatic blast and end. It arrives as a stretched out threat that keeps getting closer. First comes anxiety. The river rises slowly, but it rises. Then comes certainty. It's no longer if, it's when. By 1927, the Mississippi Basin had been pushed past wet and into saturated. Months of above normal rain and swollen tributaries kept feeding the main channel, and that water doesn't disappear. It has only one option. It moves downhill, south, pressing against levees, the way a crowd presses against a locked door, hour after hour, day after day. And people sensed it before they could prove it. Heavy air that never quite dried out, roads that felt soft under wheels, ditches that stayed full, animals that acted wrong, the land swallowing and swallowing like it was trying to hold the river in its throat. Because the most terrifying thing about a flood isn't the moment it arrives, it's the waiting. In places like Greenville, residents watch the river climb and climb, not in a single leap, but in a steady, relentless rise that made normal life feel foolish. Every day the water was higher than the day before. Every day the question got louder. How long until the levee stops being a wall and becomes a warning? And that's when the river stopped being a forecast and became a siren. You could feel it before you could measure it. Heavy air, soft roads, restless animals. The feeling that the land was swallowing and swallowing, not forever, just until it couldn't. And when the ground has nowhere left to put the water, the whole fight comes down to one thing: a wall. That's where the first great human character enters this story: the levee, a long ridge of packed earth built to turn a wild river into something predictable. In the lower Mississippi Valley, the idea was simple and seductive. If you control the edge, you control the river. Raise the wall, dominate the water. For years, that belief hardened into policy, even into doctrine. what some histories describe as a levees-only approach. Officials repeated the promise. Engineers defended it. Newspapers printed it. And when the river started climbing in 1927, the reassurance came fast. The levee system would hold. But anyone who lives beside a giant learns the truth early. You can build a wall that looks invincible, miles and miles of earthworks, high enough to feel like a fortress. And still, when the giant moves, even a little, the ground trembles. Levees are a promise you can stand on, until the day they become a stage for panic. In Greenville, Mississippi, that day arrived as a sound that changed how people breathed. Lucy Somerville Howarth was inside a lumber office, buying materials for a boat, when the fire whistle blew. Not a metaphor. A real alarm, cutting through an ordinary morning with one clear message. The river had found a way in. The news moved fast. The main levee had broken at 7:45 in the morning at Stopp's Landing, near Mounds Landing, about 18 miles north of town. And suddenly the edge everyone trusted didn't feel like an edge anymore. Trucks and labor rushed toward the protection levee. Cars tore through town as if speed could outrun water. And still, Lucy wrote, many people kept believing Greenville wouldn't flood. But disasters don't care what a town believes. They teach by taking. That night, the whistle sounded again, around 11 o'clock, and Lucy said people just went crazy. Thousands ran toward the levee, white and black, young and old, some half-dressed, some carrying bundles, all trying to get ahead of a thing that doesn't negotiate. And then came the slow horror, the part floods specialize in. Lucy described watching the water enter the city and keep rising, hour after hour, day after day. Not cinematic, not sudden, just steady, filthy inevitability, something you can see coming and still can't stop. That's why eyewitness voices matter, because disasters don't feel like history while you're inside them. They feel like, where do I go? What do I carry? Who's going to make it? Lucy hears the siren and suddenly the flood stops being a headline and becomes a direction. Go to the levee. Because once the river climbs that high, the levee isn't just a barrier anymore. It's the last line that still feels like control. Then the desperate choreography begins. Sandbags, shovels, raw hands, shifts that blur into night. Along strained sections of the levee, guards are posted to watch for the first sign of a crevasse, a break that would let the river pour straight into the land it was supposed to spare. Their job is brutally simple. Keep stacking bags, keep raising the line, keep staying ahead of water that rises anyway. Small leaks get inspected like wounds. Wet spots get studied like omens. Rumors of failures upstream spread faster than official updates because fear is a kind of weather too. And in the Delta, where cotton meant money and money meant power, the work doesn't land evenly. In Greenville, after the levee break, a refugee camp grows along the top of the levee for miles. The Red Cross organizes tents, kitchens, sanitation. The National Guard is called in to keep order, but even in a disaster, the old system doesn't take a day off. Accounts from Greenville describe African-American families being told to stay on the levee for flood control and later recovery work because local leaders feared that if black laborers evacuated, they might not return. Hundreds of black men worked in shifts repairing levees, and some reports describe them being threatened with losing access to food if they refused to work. Picture one of those men at the edge of the camp at dawn. Boots still wet, hands cracked, stomach empty. He watches the ration line form before the sun fully clears the river haze. He doesn't need a speech to understand the situation. He needs calories. He needs his family to eat. And the message in the air is simple. Relief isn't just help, it's control. Relief came with rules. So yes, there was rain, there was mud, there was a river climbing like it had all the time in the world. And there was something else forming right alongside it, a disaster made sharper by human decisions. Because the Great Flood of 1927 wasn't only water, It was a mirror, and the next moment would prove it when the wall didn't leak anymore. It broke. All that work, all those sandbags, all that faith in dirt and muscle, it was buying time, not safety. Because north of Greenville, the river was already leaning on the levee with its full weight. Levee guards camped along strained sections, stacking sandbags higher and higher until the piles were almost even with the water itself. Then on the morning of April 21st, 1927, the place everyone feared most, that same breach at Stops Landing near Mounds Landing, gave way. Greenville didn't get the news in a press release. It got it in a sound. A prearranged signal, the fire whistle, the kind of alarm that changes how your stomach feels. And suddenly the warning wasn't "watch the river." It was a movement. A man on horseback tearing down the street shouting, "Go to the levee! Go to the levee! The levee has broken!" This wasn't a leak. It wasn't a crack. It was a crevasse big enough to turn the Mississippi from high water into a rushing invasion, pouring through the break and spreading across the delta. One historical account describes the volume as so violent it helped cover nearly 1 million acres with around 10 feet of water in 10 days. And the river continued flowing through that gap for months. And once the river's on the inside, the story changes. Because the cruel truth about floodwater is this: it doesn't just rise, it traps. And remember the motif. The river wasn't feeding anything. The river was collecting. And this is what people learn too late. Water doesn't just rise, it isolates. When the levee gives way, the threat is not only the current, it's what the current does to time. Roads vanish, landmarks disappear, a neighborhood becomes open water, and suddenly the highest thing you own is your roof. The danger isn't only drowning, it's being stranded with nowhere to go, no clean water, and no way to know if rescue is coming or if it can reach you in time. In 1927, the scale of that trapping was so large that rescue turned into a numbers game. Federal relief efforts would eventually pull hundreds of thousands of people from rooftops and other high places because that was all that was left above the flood. And in towns like Greenville, people didn't experience the flood as a single moment. They experienced it as a slow takeover, the water creeping in, then rising again, day after day. Lucy Somerville Howarth would later describe the panic, the rush toward the levee, and the sickening realization that the water wasn't passing through, it was moving in. For many, shelter became the levee itself, a thin strip of high ground crowded with families, quilts, and whatever they managed to carry before the water sealed everything else off. In Greenville, an emergency refugee camp formed along the Washington Avenue levee and stretched for miles as more people arrived. Lucy ended up inside that world too, doing relief work in the camp as it grew into a system: rations, waiting lines, sanitation, tents, rules. Because once water traps you, survival stops being dramatic. It becomes logistical. And this is where the story becomes painful in a different way, because logistics always means decisions. By the time the river has trapped you on a roof or pushed you onto a levee, the danger stops being only water. Now it's logistics, it's a policy, it's power. Because the flood doesn't just destroy homes, it forces a second question into the open. Who gets help first and who gets managed? In places like Greenville, the levee itself became a thin strip of safe ground, and then a whole world. Refugee tents stretching for miles, lines for food, sanitation built from scratch, guards posted to keep order. The kind of place where survival is measured in rations, paperwork, and whether the next boat is coming for you or past you. And in a society already divided, rescue can come with conditions. Who gets evacuated first? Who gets fed first? Who gets told to wait? And who gets told to work? Because in some camps, especially in the Delta, African American families were pushed to stay on the levee, not because it was safer, but because powerful people feared what would happen if the labor force dispersed. Work crews were organized, long shifts, no pay, and the threat hanging in the air was simple and cruel: If you don't work, you don't eat. Say it out loud because it's the spine of the story. Relief came with rules. This is where the story locks in. Nature did its part, yes. The river rose, the wall broke, and the water took what it wanted. But what happened next wasn't the weather. It was a human choice. And those choices turned the flood into something bigger than a natural disaster. It became a national test of who counted, who didn't, and what relief really meant when the country was watching. And that's when the flood finds its next main character, the federal response and the man chosen to run it. And once you start asking those questions, who gets rescued first? Who gets fed first? Who gets controlled for order? Who gets left behind? You're no longer watching a flood. You're watching a country make decisions under pressure. And in 1927, when the scale became too big for any one state to carry, Washington did something Americans were not used to seeing in real time. It put a single person in the spotlight and said, "You run this." His name was Herbert Hoover. He wasn't president, not yet. In 1927, Hoover was the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, an engineer by training, a logistics mind by reputation, and President Calvin Coolidge asked him to chair a committee to assist and coordinate flood relief through the American Red Cross. Picture the room around him, maps spread wide like wounds, telegrams stacking into piles, lists of towns that don't feel like towns anymore, just coordinates and needs. Because relief wasn't a speech. It was routing. It was prioritizing. It was deciding what moved first, and every decision created a shadow. Overnight, Hoover became the face of help in a country drowning in headlines. Because relief wasn't a speech, it was a supply line. It was boats moving through what used to be roads. It was food, tents, medicine, getting to people who were stranded on levees, rooftops, and narrow strips of ground that stayed dry only by inches. It was organizing refugee camps that stretched for miles along the levees, cities of canvas where survival became rations, rules, and waiting. And Hoover understood something crucial. If the nation could see the suffering, the nation might pay attention. So he appealed publicly for donations and support, press, radio, the loudest tools of the era, turning a regional catastrophe into a national emergency people could not ignore. This is why the flood didn't just change levees, it changed expectations. After 1927, Americans didn't only ask, "What is the river doing?" They asked, "What is the federal government going to do about it?" And under that question, quiet but constant, was the other one. Relief came with rules. So whose rules? Even as Hoover and the Red Cross tried to organize a relief upriver, the Mississippi kept moving south, carrying the whole disaster toward one of the most important ports in the country. New Orleans was not just another river town. It was trade, money, shipping, and politics. A city that lived with water as a permanent threat, and a city that understood one brutal truth. If the levees failed here, the fallout would not stay local. So as the crest pushed closer, the conversation narrowed fast. Not can we stop it, but where do we let it go? And that's where the flood turns from nature into choice. In late April of 1927, officials took the most controversial option on the table. They deliberately breached a levee at Carnarvon, Louisiana, using dynamite to try to reduce pressure and lower water levels near New Orleans. Imagine a shopkeeper locking up near the river that afternoon, hearing a dull thump in the distance, then another, then the kind of vibration you feel in your ribs more than your ears. People step into the street, not to celebrate, to confirm what they already suspect. Somebody just chose who gets saved. On April 29, 1927, that blast opened the river on purpose. And when the Mississippi finds an opening, it does what it always does. It moves into the lowest ground available. In this case, floodwater poured into surrounding communities, including St. Bernard and Plaquemines parishes, turning them into the sacrifice zone in the name of protecting the city. In simple terms, save the financial heart by flooding someone with less power. And once a community believes the disaster was not just weather, but a decision, the damage doesn't end when the water falls. The water recedes. The distrust can last for generations because the river was collecting, but people were choosing where it would be spent. And even after the arguments, the promises, the choices about who would be flooded to save who, the river still had to do what rivers do. It had to move on. When the water finally started to retreat, people expected relief. But relief doesn't arrive like it does in movies. It arrives as mud up to the waist. Walls stained with high water marks that look less like measurements and more like signatures. Rotting food, contaminated wells, dead livestock in corners you don't find until the smell forces you to. And in the stagnant water left behind, sickness becomes its own threat. And then the scale hits you all at once. Along the lower river alone, historians estimate the flood damaged the homes of more than 920,000 people. Hundreds of thousands were pulled off rooftops and treetops by boat. And for many, after the flood meant refugee life, tent cities, ration lines, waiting. The Red Cross fed hundreds of thousands of people, and more than 300,000 lived as refugees in tent camps. So when the water goes down, the first question isn't poetic, it's survival. What do we plant now? How do we live now? Because the Mississippi didn't just take houses, it took certainty. And in a place where certainty is gone, rules get louder. Even help can feel like a cage. Because when the water finally pulls back, you do not just see damage, you see a map of who had options and who didn't. This is why people call it the flood that changed America. Not because it was the first big flood, but because it forced a new kind of response. After 1927, the country moved toward larger, federally directed flood control on the Mississippi. In 1928, Congress passed the Flood Control Act, which expanded the federal role and helped launch the Mississippi River and Tributaries Project, a long-term system of levees plus spillways and floodways designed to give the river somewhere to go besides your home. But the other change was harder, and it had nothing to do with concrete. Disasters do not erase inequality. They weaponize it. If you are rich, water is a tragedy. If you are poor, water is a tragedy plus hunger, entrapment, and control. And in 1927, relief camps and evacuations could reflect the same power structure the flood had just exposed. Mississippi did not vote. It did not negotiate. It did not care who you were. It just moved forward. And when the river has that much weight behind it, a country only gets two choices: prepare honestly or repeat the same mistake until the water comes back to collect again. Because the river was collecting, and the nation learned painfully that relief came with rules. And that's the point that lingers long after the water goes down. The river moved forward, and the country had to decide what it was going to become afterward. If this story made you think, hit like, comment with the part that impacted you most, and subscribe for more documentary-style stories about disasters that changed the world. And if you want the next one in this same style, tell me which historical event you want to see next. Because history, like the river, never stops moving.